On this. Joining us now is Dr. Ruth Castel-Branco, who is a senior researcher at the Southern Center for Inequality at Wits University. Doctor, a good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. So as things sit at the moment, in Maputo, for instance, things seeming to have calmed down, but the issue at hand not yet over, even limited sort of access that is now being granted at the Lebombo border post. So a big discussion around the economic, I suppose, a fallout of this unrest. But I'm keen to hear from you, from the position of the people of Mozambique, what right now is most important and is most urgent to be resolved, the election or certainly the movement of goods into the country?
Thanks so much, Naledi. I think that there's multiple interests, and there is not a coherent political vision or organizational structure behind that, which makes this a particularly complicated process. Certainly, what triggered these mass protests were the sense that the electoral results were fraudulent. And in fact, there are widespread documented examples of fraud throughout the electoral process. That combined with the repressive actions of the police in response to peaceful protests. Not all protests involved vandalism. In fact, the majority of them did not, but the police has used indiscriminate violence, starting with the brutal assassination of the opposition lawyer Elvino Dias. 2 weeks after the elections, he was meant to submit the case on behalf of Podemos and Venancio Mondlane contesting the election results, but he was assassinated before then. And then subsequently preventing citizens from laying flowers at the site of the assassination, throwing gas canisters into people's yards, firing live ammunition into the public. And we've had a very bizarre situation in Mozambique where on the one hand, you've had protests protected by the police and then camouflaged police running into those protests and firing live ammunition. And so this creates a sense of indignation across the population, really across ethnicity, religion, social class, gender. You're seeing people of all walks of life mobilizing in various ways. And so I think that the issue is all eyes are now on the Constitutional Council that has to review the electoral results and is interrogating the National Elections Commission. But ultimately, many of the original tabulations for those results have since been destroyed, and it'll be either a case of a negotiated outcome between the ruling party and the opposition party, or some kind of declaration of new elections. What complicates this further, of course, is that the president is in the last 2 months of his mandate. There's significant factionalism within the ruling party, and some believe that this chaos actually stands in his favor because it can create the basis for calling a state of emergency and ultimately not handing over the reins of power to the president-elect Daniel Chapo. So there's lots of different interests at play that have to do with sort of the political conditions and the socioeconomic conditions, which include the frustrations, the long-term frustrations with the current regime in Mozambique, and those have kind of coalesced in the figure of Venancio Mondlane.
What happens if you see the leadership for Frelimo digging in their heels, right, and insisting that this is their election? And I mentioned earlier that things seem to have quieted down this evening in Maputo, for instance, but could it be that the leadership there is waiting for that unrest and the civic fatigue to then set in?
Yes, certainly. I think that that's part of the strategy. Although the President Nyusi today met with the chief pastor of the church, Venancio Mondlane, the opposition leader, is also a preacher. And so that seems to suggest some overtures towards conversation. But as some of the Frelimo leadership have said until now, conversation should not be confused with negotiation. So they have stood firm behind the position that they've won 72% of the vote, that they have won even more seats than they did in the last election, something that is rather remarkable because over the last 6 years, Poverty rates in Mozambique have increased by 20%. You have widespread inequality, deteriorating public services with the imposition of austerity and our public debt crisis. And yet it seems like Mozambique has bucked the trend, and the ruling party has gained seats rather than lost seats. And so I think that all of this has stimulated a lot of skepticism in the electoral results. And ultimately, it'll be a question of whether Frelimo was willing to negotiate with Podemos and the other opposition parties.
Yeah, well, we really do appreciate your time. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Dr. Ruth Castel-Branco there, who is an analyst with Wits University, sharing her thoughts on the situation as it unfolds in Mozambique.